Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Excellent. Well, I'm Joel Martin. I'm the president of Wagner College, and it's my honor to have a chance to introduce our Black History Month scholar, Dr. Sheila Walker, who we've had a really great visit with for a few days, and I've had a chance to have 2 meals with her. I've been very blessed today. And thinking about introducing her tonight, I was reminded of something my neighbor says, which probably isn't true. I haven't done the study yet. But she says that Staten Island itself, as opposed to across the water here to New Jersey, is actually a geological formation that was part of Africa. And so I don't know if that's geologically true, but it's certainly true. It speaks a different type of truth that I think is important for us to all acknowledge, which is it's impossible to understand the U.S. without understanding Africa and its connections. So there's no such thing as just Black History Month. Every day is Black History Day here in this country. And that's true because of the African diaspora. And we have a foremost scholar of the African diaspora with us tonight. We're very honored to have you here, Dr. Walker. I'll say a few things about her record, which is remarkable. And we're very thrilled that Dr. Rita Reynolds and the committee has selected her as the scholar to come with us today. Thank you very much for the work that you did to find her, bring her here, recruit her. And hopefully you'll come back. Now, this is her first visit to Staten Island, and so we hope you'll come back many times. She's a cultural anthropologist, documentary filmmaker, and expert in the African diaspora, who has done field work, lectured, and participated in cultural events in most of Africa and the global African diaspora. And by global, it really is global. She may allude to that later. She currently serves as Executive Director of Afro-Diaspora Incorporated with the goal to share her experiences and knowledge of the global African diaspora. She's written several books, one of them called African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas, and a companion documentary, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora. She's organized international conferences on this theme. She's got a more recent documentary entitled Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, A Global African Diaspora. She was a professor of anthropology and director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, professor of anthropology and director of the African Diaspora and the World Program at Spelman College. She teaches in English, Portuguese, French, and Spanish. So she's free to teach in any language she wants to teach in tonight, and we'll respect her, whichever language she chooses. I would take a poll, but we'll leave it up to her to decide. 4 languages that she can teach in. And so whichever language you choose to teach in, we're very blessed to hear you tonight. Thank you for being here with us. Please welcome Dr. Walker. Please.
Então, eu vou começar no primeiro idioma da diáspora africana. Todo mundo compreende, né? Não? Nada? Spanish? Portuguese. Thank you. Portuguese. The first language of the African diaspora in the Americas. From the first African culture of the Americas, Brazil, second African nation on the planet after Nigeria. So the second African nation on earth is in the Americas. So I want to begin with that word. First of all, I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to get to know a little bit about Staten Island. I have to acknowledge I'm from Jersey, I'm from East Orange, and I've never been here before. And like many other people, I thought this was part of Jersey. Sorry. I always forget, so I want to remember right up front, to define the term diaspora. Because I talk about it all the time, and then people look at me funny like, huh, what is that? What are we talking about? So, it's a simple word, dia, across. Diameter, diagonal, spora. The seeds on a fern, the plant, are called spores, and when the leaves wave in the wind, the spores get planted. So Diaspora means to sow, S-O-W, like sowing seeds, across, and refers to the sowing of seeds of Africa around the world. And sometimes I ask, how many people here are of African origin? And, okay, one. I'll really ask it. How many people of African origin? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all right? You don't have to look like you're of African origin to be of African origin, you know. Well, having asked that question, then I have to ask the other question. One of the things we know now, as a result of the research of paleoanthropologists or paleoarchaeologists, people who study old human presences, I'm not one of those. We know from geneticists who found that the oldest human genetic material is in Africa, that most of the human genetic material is in Africa, it never left, and that Africa is more genetically complex than everybody in the rest of the world. And linguists have figured out that the oldest languages in the world are in Africa because they have the most sound. So you evolve from more to less, not from less to more. So it appears, I'm not a linguist, but this is what I've read, and it's convincing, that the oldest languages are the languages of the Kongsan people, languages with the clicks, Miriam Makeba, click song. Those are the oldest languages. So the oldest bones, the oldest genetic material, and the oldest languages are from Africa. One photo that I always have in mind, I'm not going to show you because I don't have it with me, is one of my favorite characters, Lucy. Lucy used to be the oldest human who had been found, and she was found in Ethiopia. One of the things I liked about her was when people talked about the origin of man, I could say, yeah, the first man was a woman. So I thought that was great. Lucy is no longer the oldest. She's only 3,200,000 years old. But she had older relatives, the Ardis. That's, I don't know whose name this is. Lucy's not known as Lucy, where she's from, Ethiopia. She's known as Dinkanesh, which in Amharic, major language of Ethiopia, means you are wonderful, you are magnificent. And I really like her because I've gotten to visit her. I haven't gotten to visit others of those old great-great-grandmothers. Some of them you really can't visit. So far, the oldest humanoid that I've read about, he's called, well, his scientific name is Sahelanthropus chadensis. His local name is Tumai, and he's about 6 or 7 million years old, but he was found in little pieces. So there's a skull made out of teeny little pieces. You can't really visit that. Lucy you can visit. She's in the museum in Addis Ababa, the National Museum of Ethiopia. And they actually have her, all of her bones. So although she's no longer the oldest, she's the most complete skeleton found. Well, the most complete skeleton found who's over 300 million years old, over 3 million years old. So what we know now is that until modern humans, so humans evolved from primitive humans to modern humans in Africa, and about 80,000 years ago, Africans began to, or human beings, and Africans, it's their equivalent at that point, human beings began to leave Africa to populate the rest of the world. So, if you're not of African origin, you're from a different planet. Mars, perhaps, Venus, you know, one of those other ones. So I just think that's such an interesting fact. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I don't know very much about all that stuff that happened so long ago. That's hard for me to imagine. And as a cultural anthropologist, my research involves going to visit live human beings. And that's what interests me. I want to be able to go visit. So I couldn't be an historian. With the president today, we were talking about what they do, historians, and what we do, anthropologists. The first person to do to talk about the global African diaspora was an historian, Joseph Harris, who made a map of the global African diaspora. The map came out in 1980. And I taught at Spelman College. That was the first time I taught at an historically black college. And when I taught my first class, I saw one of those Rand McNally map racks. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Joseph Harris's map was on this map rack? But I thought it probably isn't, though. And as I got closer, I realized that the map that was facing me was exactly that map. And so it's the Global African Diaspora. Harris did his research in Asia, in places like Turkey and in India. He wrote a book called The African Presence in Asia. And he did a lot of, beginning in the 80s, he did a lot of lectures around his map. And I followed this man around like a puppy, because I was so fascinated by this map. And the map had all these arrows from various places in Africa to various places on the planet. I knew the Americas, but I couldn't imagine those other maps that went places like Turkey, Persian Gulf, India, Nagasaki in Japan. And so I wanted to follow those arrows and go to all those places where Africans had gone, voluntarily as well as involuntarily. And so I still see Joseph Harris. He's still talking about his map and talking about the African diaspora. And I went to India, to Janjira Island. He used to talk a lot about Janjira Island. It's an island in south of Mumbai on the Konkani coast, and the Afro-Indians, referred to as Siddhis, controlled maritime traffic on the Konkani coast for centuries. So I saw Joe Harris after I'd been there, and I said, yeah, Joe, I went to Janjira. So what did you think of it when you went, Joe? And he said, I didn't go. He went to the archives. I'm an anthropologist. I have to go. And he said, well, that's your responsibility. So I thought, I was trying to follow in this man's footsteps, and he hadn't gone. So I'm glad I didn't know that, and I'm glad I went. And eventually, I will show you some images. I think I show you Janjira. What I'll show you images of are kind of beyond exactly what my title is. I can't stay within the boundaries of the United States. I'm like relentlessly comparative, relentlessly global. But so I had to go to Janjira Island, following Joe Harris, who hadn't gone there. What I will show you is a 5-minute clip from a documentary I made that's called Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, A Global African Diaspora. I called it and not the, because it's not exhaustive. It's places I've been. I know I need to go to other places. It's not all the places I've been. It's kind of a sample of places where you do and do not expect African descendants to be. There are places where the presence of African descendants is denied by Encyclopedia Britannica, by the president of the country. For example, the president of Argentina was at the Davos Economic Summit, I think in 2018, and he said, well, we in Argentina, we're all European, and so, we're part of a European economy. Well, if they're all European, that doesn't explain why the national dance of Argentina has a Central African Bantu name, tango. So some of these claims in the Americas are false, and there's evidence of the falseness of the claims. But if you check out Encyclopedia Britannica, it will tell you there are no Afro-Argentinians, there are no Afro-Bolivians, there are no Afro-Paraguayans, and there's certainly no Afro-Chileans. In spite of the fact that they don't exist, I had a conference to which I invited them. I did a book in which they wrote their own stories, because I thought it was very important for me to help facilitate their telling their stories. And I see their stories as part of my story. So I'm from Jersey, but I don't think I have to be limited to that. My current identity, after years and years and years of travels and research in the global African diaspora, is that I'm a citizen of the global African diaspora with a US passport as a result of a slave ship. It's illogical to be an Afro-North American, statistically. When Africans were being brought involuntarily to the Americas during the hundreds of years of the Atlantic commerce and African lives, that I think it's kind of trivialized when you call it the slave trade. That sounds like you're trading baseball cards rather than human lives. Only 5% of the Africans brought to the Americas wound up in British North America. 45% wound up in Brazil. Hence, eu falei Português. That's why I had to speak Portuguese with you, because that's the first language. We in the United States have a tendency to think that we're the center of the world, and some of us have a tendency to think that the African diaspora in the United States is the capital, the largest place, the most significant part of the African diaspora, and that's absolutely false, absolutely misled. The first country is Brazil. Brazil has the government, according to the 2010 census, acknowledged that the population of Afro-Brazilians was 54% of the nation, over 100 million people. We can't compete here in the United States with those numbers. The number of Africans brought to the United States was about the number of some Caribbean islands during the period of enslavement. So I think it's important to know who's where. There are no countries in the Americas without an African descended population. I thought there were a few, there are none, and in all of those countries there are organized groups of Afro-descendants, and that includes places like Paraguay, places like El Salvador, where the presence is not very visible, but there it is. There are films about both Afro-Chileans and Afro-Paraguayans, so they exist. When I think about the African diaspora, I started with the Americas, but then had to learn about other places too. I went to an important moment for me was December 3rd, 2000. I went to the Americas Preparatory Conference for the United Nations World Conference Against Racism. That was in Durban, South Africa in August to September 2001. It could have had more press. It could have been a better known phenomenon, but 9/11 happened, and so it disappeared. It has had the United Nations Conference Against Racism. I don't think it's had very much impact on the United States. I don't think it's particularly well known in the United States, but has anybody ever heard of it? No? Okay. It has had, however, very significant impacts in South America. It was at that conference that the hundreds of years of enslavement of Africans was declared to be a crime against humanity. The United Nations has a commemoration on the 24th or 25th of March every year for the victims of transatlantic slavery and the slave trade. I have a critique of that commemoration because it suggests that the phenomenon of the enslavement of Africans was just Atlantic. And that's not true. It's not the first area of enslavement of Africans. And I think the United Nations should do better. But the populations that insisted upon having such a commemoration are Atlantic populations. So where else are African diasporans? Well, the first the involuntary and voluntary diasporas went to places like India, the places around the Red Sea, to the Persian Gulf, so east of Africa, not west. One simple reason why that could have happened, and when I understood this, it was like a blinding flash of the obvious. If you look at the size of the bodies of water around Africa, you understand why it took Africans a long time to be brought across the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is huge. The Indian Ocean is not. The Red Sea is really not. And the area between India and East Africa has the advantage of the monsoon. So if you put a boat in the water on the coast of East Africa, a dhow, that's the name of the sailboats used in the Indian Ocean, depending upon which way the wind is blowing, the wind will blow the dhow either from Africa to India or from India to Africa, because that's where the winds go, the monsoons. And I never remember which way is which way, but in one direction, I mean, during 6 months, it blows from east to west, and during 6 months, it blows from west to east. So that means that back in the day, before movable sails, if you left Africa and went to India, you couldn't come right back. You had to wait another 6 months for the wind to bring you back. But there was tremendous trade. between Africa and India. The kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, that's on the Red Sea. Aksum had trading colonies in India. So all Africans did not leave Africa involuntarily. Some left as merchants, some left militarily. And in Gujarat, in northwest Africa, northwest India, the state of Gujarat, there's an African saint, an Abyssinian saint, Ethiopian saint, Baba Gore, who went as an agate merchant. And being from Abyssinia, he was probably Christian, but now he's a Muslim saint. So things happen along the way. He also revolutionized the technology of agate production and sale in Gujarat. So he's a major example of a way of leaving Africa, going someplace else without being taken involuntarily. And he also initially was a saint only of the Afro-Indians, called in Gujarat, in the northwest, in Hyderabad, in the central east, and in Karnataka on the southwest of India. All these Afro-Indian communities are referred to as cities. And so Baba Gore was initially a saint of the cities, but he apparently was very effective as a saint, and members of other religious persuasions in India have become worshippers of Baba Gore. Not necessarily exclusively, but he came with his family, a sister and a brother, and they've become important saints for many people, particularly around Gujarat and around Mumbai in India. So that's why I can't stay just within the context of the Americas when I talk about the African diaspora. It's why I have to see it as global. Why I have to see connections that are not necessarily obvious. Like, there's an Abyssinian saint in Gujarat. Well, there's an Abyssinian saint in Paraguay also. He's an Abyssinian saint you may know something about without knowing what you know. When European Catholics were trying to Christianize Africans, one of the tactics was to find African saints and say, well, this is your saint. And so one of those saints, he's not really a saint in the Bible, but he does get to be a saint for the Catholics, is Balthazar, the African of the three wise men, from Abyssinia also. And he is the patron saint of the Afro-Paraguayans. And I find it really interesting. I have no explanation for exactly how that happened. It's not a coincidence. It has to do with human movement. But I think it's interesting that both the Afro-Paraguayans and Afro-Indians in Gujarat have a saint who is from Abyssinia, the Christian kingdom in East Africa. Speaking of the Christian kingdom in East Africa, it's useful to know, and I guess there's a relatively decent amount of research. All of the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, were involved in the enslavement of African people. Most of the Africans were enslaved in the Americas by European Christians. Most who were taken east were taken by Muslims from various places. So nobody's innocent in the process. Everybody's somehow involved. The Catholic Church in the 1450s, the Pope, I think was Pope Nicholas, maybe the fifth, I may have his name wrong, said he issued a papal bull that said it is fine to enslave Africans and Saracens referring to Muslims, so people who were not Christian. It was fine to enslave them. Presumably enslaving them would allow them to become Christians. That's just a fact. In the Americas, given who colonized most of the Americas, and from where we are in space, we might not think about that, but most of the Americas speak Spanish and Portuguese. What does that mean? That means that Spain and Portugal colonized most of the space in the Americas. That's why all those countries in South America, except Brazil, speak Spanish, except for the three little bitty ones, the three Guyanas, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. Everybody else speaks Portuguese or Spanish. And because of the nature of that colonization, the nature of that enslavement, there are a lot of Catholic festivities in South America for African and African descendant saints. And I'll show you a little bit about that because it's fundamental in the belief systems of these populations. I remember exactly when I learned one of the most foundational bits of data about the Americas, which was who built the Americas. We are given the impression that the Americas, and I mean Chile to Canada, I don't just mean the United States, that the Americas are a European creation. Except that most of the people who came to the Americas during most of the history of the Americas came not from Europe, but from Africa. 6.5 million people crossed the Atlantic Ocean from Africa and Europe to the Americas between 1500 and 1800, and 1 million came from Europe. 5.5 million came from Africa. So plus we know what had happened to the indigenous people, right? Within 100 years of the European presence, 90% of the indigenous people had been essentially killed off. Not necessarily deliberately, because they were supposed to be the workforce for the European colonizers, but European illnesses killed them before they were mistreated to death. So most of the human beings who were in the Americas during the first 300 years of the modern history of the Americas came from Africa. So how are you going to talk about the Americas as a European creation when almost everybody who was part of the foundation of the Americas came from Africa? And where did I get this information? I'm not an historian. I didn't research that. There is a database, the name of which is slavevoyages, plural, .org. And it's a register of more than 35,000 ships that brought enslaved Africans to the Americas. 35,000. We were told that we couldn't know much. I mean, we who study this stuff. The first database came out in 2001. And it just totally contradicted the idea that you couldn't know which Africans came from where, wound up where, what the implications were, how many came from where. The commerce in African lives was commerce, it was business, and business leaves records. It leaves port records. On this database, the information is provided of the name of the ship, the name of the captain, where did the ship leave from? Did it leave from Liverpool in the United Kingdom? Did it leave from La Rochelle in France? Did it leave from Seville in Spain? Did it leave from Lisbon in Portugal? Where did it go in Africa? Did it go to Angola? Did it go to the Gold Coast? Did it go to the Senegambia? All that information is there. How many men, how many women, how many children were embarked where? It's interesting to note that in the 19th century, over half of the Africans brought to the Americas were children. Children. This is by, good Christians. It wasn't a nice commerce. And the most expensive commodity traded in the Atlantic world was enslaved African human beings. I think that's really important for understanding the creation of the Americas and some of the problems that exist now. How is the kind of inequality that exists now in the Americas, how did it happen? Well, that's how it happened. And just get over it. No, it's not finished. It's the basis of what we're doing now. So, that's the basis. But I'm interested in talking not just about what happened, not just about the horrors, but about what kind of creativity came with these Africans. I didn't learn anything about enslavement in East Orange High School. I learned everything I learned after getting a doctorate. I had to educate myself after my professors tried to teach me that African Americans had no history, no culture, no connections with Africa. So one of the things I began to know more about, that I began to research was, okay, so what did Africans bring? Which Africans brought from where, when, to where? The commerce in enslaved Africans was absolutely systematic. There was nothing random about it. Africans weren't brought from just any place. They were brought from specific places for specific reasons. The area that's called the Rice Coast, there was an area called the Rice Coast, an area called the Gold Coast. Well, what was that about? That was about what was the knowledge base, what was the technology of the area of the era that these Africans were masters and mistresses of. It's important to consider gender. Rice, for example, the rice that enriched Southern planters so much that they wanted to secede from the Union, hence the Civil War. Those rice planters were brought from the Rice Coast because they knew the technology of planting, harvesting, cooking rice, which is really complex. Men prepared the land, women owned the seeds, knew which seeds to use where, under which conditions. Women harvested the rice, and women cooked the rice, creating culinary traditions, what's called Creole food in Louisiana, even Cajun food, which does not refer to Africa, Arcadia, Canada. Low country cuisine, Georgia, South Carolina. That should be called West African cuisine because the rice came from West Africa. It was rice that was domesticated in Africa along the Senegambian coast and along the banks of the Niger River. The kind of technology that Africans brought is still used in rice fields in South Carolina and Georgia. The complexity is that the technique involves letting salt water in and then flushing the salt water out with river water. And so that involves building rice trunks to control the movement of the water. And so men did that, women did the planting. I was asked to talk about, I don't know, women during enslavement. And that was when I realized, whoops, I had been thinking of rice planters as men. Totally wrong. The technology that accompanies the rice, basket weaving, for example, weaving baskets to use to winnow the rice. That's all women's work. Men had other work, but that's women's work. So it's important to reconsider the phenomenon of the enslavement of Africans as not just a random importation of unskilled laborers, but rather a very specific, well thought out importation of experts in the technology of the period. So rice, you will see a poster that says, rice Negroes for sale. Another technology that was very important in the creation of the Americas was gold metallurgy. Europeans came to the Americas to get rich, looking for El Dorado, the countries of gold. Native Americans in South America had gold, and Europeans wanted it. When they discovered it, the gold of the Native Americans, they didn't have the technology. If they did, they would have stayed in Spain and Portugal. They wouldn't have crossed an ocean that had sea monsters and stuff. So what did they do? They went to the Gold Coast, where the Portuguese had been trading in gold with members of the Akan-speaking ethnic group from the middle of the 1400s. So when they began to enslave Africans in the 1500s, they knew where to go to find people who knew gold technology. They went to what the Portuguese called a Costa da Mina, that British, when the British became the colonial masters, called the Gold Coast, currently Ghana. Why is it named Ghana now? Because once Ghana became independent in 1957, they got rid of the colonial name that was about what their colonial masters extracted, the wealth that their colonial masters extracted, and they named themselves for the Empire of Ghana, that from 300 to 1100 or 1300, the current era, was a major gold-producing area in West Africa. So it was to rename themselves, kind of from a colonial name to a pre-colonial name. They were asserting a continuity of African technological knowledge, essentially. And so when these Africans were brought from the Gold Coast, the Portuguese and Spanish referred to them as negros minas, mining Negroes. And in Minas Gerais, a major center of gold production in Brazil, particularly in the city of Ouro Preto, black gold, it was said that the presence of negros minas in gold mines brought an almost magical luck in finding gold. I suspect that there was absolutely no luck involved. These people were imported because of their knowledge. They knew how to find gold, and having found it, they knew how to work it. And it's a very complex situation. So for us to understand which Africans are where in the Americas and why, we need to understand that the commerce in enslaved African lives was really a transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas and a brain drain. So there's a book that kind of theorizes this very well. It's called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In 1500, when the three worlds, not two worlds, as was said in '92, when the three worlds of Europe, Africa, and the Americas met, they were all at about the same level of technological evolution. If you go to Jamestown, the first British settlement in North America, they show you the three technologies that met. The indigenous technology, the Powhatan, the British technology, and the technology of the first Africans, now recognized to be Angolans. The 20 and odd Negroes were from Angola in Central Africa. So they were at about the same level of technological evolution. What happened in the Atlantic world? First of all, the indigenous people were essentially killed off. Africans were brought to work, therefore their work benefited the Americas, but their absence was a disadvantage from Europe. So their knowledge helped the Americas evolve, and their absence kept Africa from evolving at the same pace, or at a pace at which it would have developed had they still been there rather than in the Americas. So only if we understand, so in the museum in Jamestown, on Jamestown Island in Virginia, they show you the different technologies. They talk about the evolution, and they have, I'm not sure how broadly this message has been shared, but the first time, I taught at the College of William and Mary, and I never went to the museum in Jamestown because I didn't want to hear that colonial story about the good British and the savages, the indigenous people, and the slaves. I don't call people slaves. Slaves are, first of all, Aimé Césaire from Martinique referred to the chosification, the thingification of people. So to call people slave is to suggest that they are just merchandise, as opposed to human beings with agency, with will, with culture, with knowledge, and with the intention to, in some way, maintain their culture, their humanity, who were required in the Americas to create new cultural forms, new identities, new names, new languages. For example, in the Americas, Africans created new Creole languages. The French Creole that's spoken in Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, St. Lucia, Dominica. That was created by Africans. The English Creoles of the Americas in the United States, Jamaica, all those English-speaking places, they were created by Africans. I bet all of you in this room use some African words every day, whether you know it or not. Does anybody know which African words you use every day? Nobody knows? Wow. Wow. Wow is a Wolof word from Senegal. It's not British English. It's a Wolof word. I bet you use it, right? Okay, of course, in Wolof from Senegal. When I was a little girl, my father used to call some of his friends cats. And some of them were hip cats. And I knew what a cat was, I knew how to write cat, but I didn't know why my father referred to his friends as cats. I thought that was odd. And the hip cats, I knew what a hip was, but why was he calling these men hip cats? Anybody know? Anybody ever use those words? Nobody's ever heard those words or used those words? Maybe. Okay. Well, I studied a little Wolof from Senegal, the rice people, okay? And one of the things I learned was that kat in Wolof means somebody who does something. Khipi. Youssou N'Dour, famous singer from Senegal, has an album called Khipi. Wake up, get woke, know what's going on. Be hip. So a khipi kat in Wolof means the same thing that a hip cat means in English. Somebody who knows what's going on, somebody who currently would be referred to as woke. Now having figured that out, I wondered why women were called chicks. So men are cats and women are chicks. What does a woman have in common with a little chicken? Nothing that I knew. But then I learned in Wolof that jeg meant woman. So we have kat and jeg, which explained to me hip cats and chicks. We have nonsense words in English that we may not think of as nonsense words. Other languages probably have them too. Where I'm from, we used to jump rope with two ropes. We called it French. we knew that there was a version in which you turn the ropes to the outside, and that was called double Dutch. But we didn't do that, so that was never part of it. It was a word I understood, an expression I understood, but I didn't do that, because we didn't do that in East Orange. Well, I have a friend who speaks Wolof and English, and she had a friend who spoke English and Wolof, and they were talking about nonsense expressions in English, like to jump double Dutch. Now, what does that mean? In Wolof, double means to jump. Touch, when you hit the ground. Double touch. Like double Dutch, when you jump and hit the ground. That makes a little more sense. I was curious about the word for pepper. In Wolof, it's cani. Cayenne pepper. I went to Cayenne, French Guiana, looking for some cayenne pepper. And I asked people for cayenne pepper, and they would just give me a fresh pepper, and I would say, no, it's powder. And like, no, we don't have that. I'm like, no, it's called cayenne pepper. You must have, this is cayenne. I was in Georgia. My mother's from Georgia. My mother would say, we call it kine. I was at the home of a Senegalese, and I asked him, and I know a few words of Wolof. I'm the kani, do you have pepper? Kani, pepper. And when I said kani, I thought, my mother says it's called kine. And he said, amul kani, there is no pepper. I said, what kind of African are you? You don't have any pepper, how is that possible? In hearing that, in saying that, I understood that what is called cayenne pepper has nothing to do with cayenne, and that that's a Europeanization of this Wolof word. I also wondered, why were the cops called the fuzz? Fas in Wolof means horse. And I thought about going to parades as a little girl, and those crowd control police on horses. What's more intimidating, the cop or the horse? I think it's the horse. Anyway, so that's about how can we understand US English if we don't understand the Wolof words in US English? Huh? So there are a lot of elements of life in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas that you can't really understand unless you understand the African origins. I mean, how are you going to imagine telling the story of the Americas without the majority of the people who were the creators of the foundations of it? So I would like to show you 5 minutes from a documentary I made, and I'm interested in making documentaries because I am so aware that people, when I talk about the African diaspora, don't really know what I'm talking about. When I say, oh yeah, I was with my friend Juan Angola Maconde, 2 African names. When I met this person, he said, buenas noches, yo soy Juan Angola Maconde de Bolivia, no tenemos cultura africana. I'm Juan Angola Maconde from Bolivia, we don't have any African culture. And I said, Angola Maconde? You have 2 African last names. Now, how do you not have any African culture? Well, he didn't know what of his culture was African. I don't know. Now, I don't know if he knew at that point that his names were African. I know people in the United States who have clearly African names who don't know or admit that their names are African. I went to school in East Orange, New Jersey with somebody whose last name was Cuff. Cuff, Kofi, male born on Friday in the Akan languages of Ghana and Ivory Coast. Like Kofi Annan, late former Secretary General of the United States. I went to school with a woman named Ouida. Well, Ouida was a major port of exit of enslaved Africans in Benin, in West Africa. My great-grandmother, back in the time when African Americans didn't claim any African ancestors, everybody had a Cherokee great-grandmother, long straight hair all the way down her back, could sit on it. I knew my great-grandmother, she did have long, wavy hair, but she couldn't sit on it. So I thought, maybe that's not the person. I found out that my great-grandmother, the alleged Native American, her name was Amelia Congo. So I have a bunch of relatives in Delaware whose name is Congo. And when I've asked them, well, what did you think about having an African name? African name? So a lot of them didn't know. They had an African name. There's one cousin, I had asked him about his African name, and he said, oh yes, I know, I knew. How did you know? I'm an anthropologist, I have to ask questions. He said, my father told me. What did he tell you? He told you you had an African name? He said, yes, he told us we had an original name. No one gave it to us. And I said, anthropologist, right? So he told you you had an African name? Yes. He told us we had an original name, nobody gave it to us. So he never said what I said. I said African. He said original. I thought, he was telling me something that wasn't exactly what I was asking. He was telling me something different. What he was telling me was that they had not been named by enslavers. Now, he didn't know, I believe, that the name was African. Now he does. And so I've really messed up things. I said, how did you know? Oh, you told us. Well, that's really a drag for the anthropologist. But, so Juan Angola Maconde probably didn't know that he had two African names until I told him. Angola, the country, there was a kingdom. The Angola was the head of the kingdom of Ndongo, and the Maconde are a group of people in East Africa who have a major modern art tradition. So I don't think Juan Angola Maconde knew that. So it's important to me to show you people like Juan Angola Maconde, who, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, doesn't exist. So I don't know, I think he does. So I will, if I can figure out exactly what to do with the technology. This is not my tribe, I'm of the Macintosh tribe. I would like to show you a few minutes about the Global African Diaspora. The African diaspora is global. People of African origin are all over the world, sometimes in unexpected places. Between 1500 and 1800, 6.5 million people came to the Americas. 5.5 million came from Africa as victims of the commerce in African lives called the transatlantic slave trade. So for the first 3 centuries of the modern Americas, most of the people who laid the foundations of the new societies were of African origin. Some were enslaved for their knowledge and skills, providing a transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas. In Ecuador, African descendants pan gold, from which they make beautiful creations. Using technologies inherited from ancestors from the Gold Coast, now Ghana, enslaved for their expertise in gold mining. Africans brought with them the seeds and skills to grow rice that had been domesticated more than 3,000 years earlier in Mali. U.S. plantation owners asked slave ship captains to bring them rice Negroes. Many enslaved Africans sought to regain their freedom, some by escaping to inaccessible places. In Suriname, they fled up rivers into the dense rainforest and established free Maroon communities. Maroon descendants in Colombia affirm their heroic past and continue an African lifestyle. Jamaica's national heroine, freedom-seeking Maroon leader Queen Nanny, is featured on a bill that people call a nanny. And in the United States, Harriet Tubman, who led African Americans from Southern slavery to Northern freedom, will be the first woman featured on U.S. currency. Some are already calling the bill a Tubman. Africans recreated their cultures in the Americas. Royal traditions from the Central African Congo Kingdom are still celebrated in Brazil and Panama. Also in Brazil, descendants of Yoruba people from Nigeria and Benin in West Africa celebrate their orishas, spiritual beings whose choreographies represent forces of nature. More than 200 million people of African descent now live throughout the Americas, continuing traditions that reflect their African origins. But the African diaspora is not just in the Atlantic world. In Turkey, descendants of Africans enslaved across the Mediterranean Sea during the Ottoman Empire affirmed their identity as Afro-Turks. And across the globe, from the Atlantic world, it is in India that the African diaspora is most significant. Tens of thousands of Afro-Indians known as Siddis, whose ancestors came from East Africa, have created rich cultural forms in several parts of the country. Siddis built monumental constructions, such as the nationally landmarked fort on Janjira Island, from which they controlled maritime traffic on the Konkani coast for centuries. In Gujarat, Siddhis built a shrine for their African saint, the Abyssinian Baba Gor, who was also worshipped by other Indians. Siddhis celebrated when Barack Obama became President of the United States, some proudly characterizing him as an American Siddhi. The African musical bow that Siddhis play for Baba Gor and call by the Bantu name Malunga is the faraway twin of the Afro-Brazilian berimbau. Linked by common origins and cultural continuities, people of African descent scattered around the world now form a global community. Thank you. I love to see this because I get to relive all my experiences and all these interesting places, and to see people I met in all these interesting places, and see places I need to go back to so I can learn more about all those interesting people and all those interesting places. I think it's really important, well, for me it's very important to show these folks because they are invisibilized. They're invisibilized in their countries and they're invisibilized in the world. One of the comments I tend to get is, Afro-Turks? I didn't imagine they existed. Well, they do, and you got to see some. But I don't know a lot about them. So you saw images from the calf feast, calf in the sense of little cow. And so I went to the calf feast a few years ago. And I'm going to go again in June so that I can learn more, because I feel a real responsibility to show this version of the story that tends not to be made into common knowledge. And I think, particularly for African descendants who are told how limited our story is, it's really important to know that, no, it's a global story. And there is a sense of connection. You know, when I went to visit these Afro-Turks, they were thrilled that I came and that I was going to help other people know that they exist. People like to exist. They like to be known. And what I found was that there was a real sense of identification with us in the United States and with other African descendants in other places in one way in which various people I've talked to in various places have one way in which they've understood that there is an African diaspora and that it's global, is watching soccer games, the World Cup, the Soccer World Cup. I was in Sweden during one of those World Cup matches, and I was at the home of a Swedish friend. The match was on, and it was between Saudi Arabia and someplace else. I can't remember right now what the other place was, but it's not a place known for its African descendants. But it looked like it was a match between Benin and Nigeria, because so many of the soccer players were African descendants. So Sweden, you don't usually think of that as a place where there's a large African descendant population, but there really is, because of the refugee phenomenon of people leaving the African continent because they can't make a living there. So the old African diaspora is becoming re-globalized as a result of new population dynamics, new reasons to leave the continent, new reasons to want to go to other places, and new opportunities elsewhere. So it's of interest to me to just learn more about all this, to share this knowledge, and to look at the kind of layering that exists of various Africans, African diasporans in unexpected places, expected as well as unexpected places. And if we're going to know the story of the Americas, it's really fundamental that we know the story of Africa in the Americas. How are you going to talk about the Americas without knowing these other maps. I see not just the European colonial map that we all know. We may not think of it that way, but if we look at the map of the Americas, we see who speaks Spanish, who speaks French, you know, the colonial map. I see another map, those Congos. You saw Congo royals in Brazil and in Panama. Well, there were also Congo royals in New York. There were Pinkster celebrations on Long Island, in Poughkeepsie, places like that in New York. And they were celebrations of Congo royalty. They don't exist anymore. That was during the Dutch period. There are now recreations. I saw one at Phillips Manor, someplace on the Hudson River. One of those.
Phillipsburg Manor.
Thank you, Phillipsburg Manor. You need a historian. You really need historians because they know stuff. But I have a comparative perspective on the Americas. I always see things spilling over the national boundaries. I was asked by UNESCO to write an article about the Africanity of the United States, the elements of cultural Africanity in the United States. And I said, wait a minute, you mean I really have to stay within the borders? Can I compare to, I don't know, to Panama, to Peru? No, you can only talk about the United States. Well, I felt really, limited by not being able to compare. I understood a lot about us in the United States as a result of going to Brazil. I understood a lot about our food, about our music, about our celebrations, about our spirituality. I went to a church in Newark, New Jersey when I was 8, and I think it was a Baptist church, and when the music got hot, some of those ladies with the hats on and the purses got happy. Were filled with the Spirit, started standing up, singing, dancing. But what is this? I was told that it was the Spirit. They were moved by the Spirit. Okay, but I was 8, I didn't get it. I went to Brazil, I went to an Afro-Brazilian candomblé ceremony, and I thought, I get it now. I saw the same gestures that I had seen in Hopewell Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. I saw those same gestures in Bahia, Salvador da Bahia in Brazil. That helped me understand. So we have behaviors in the United States that don't make sense without Africa. And everybody has those behaviors. Everybody who says, wow, everybody who says, oh, that's it. That came from Africa. That's not European. So on that note, I would like to stop monologuing and suggest that we have a little interaction. So a Q&A. I hope you have questions, comments, objections, corrections. This is all an evolving process. So I hope that you will participate in this evolving process, and I expect to learn some more before I leave. Thank you very much. Yes?
It's very interesting. And so far I haven't touched upon 2 continents, Europe and Oceania. In Europe, for example, in France and in Portugal, there are many Africans. Would you like to call them African diaspora? So this is the first question in Europe. How about Oceania? For example, people in Papua New Guinea and the Aboriginals in Australia, they look very much like Africans. What's the connection between them and Africa?
Excellent challenge. Excellent challenge. Thank you very much. There was an exhibit at the, formerly the Sackler Gallery. I think that's not a good name anymore because of the Sackler family's involvement with opioids. So the Gallery of Asian Art at the Smithsonian. There was an exhibit on Portugal in the world, and it had a great title. It was called Encompassing the World. So it was Portugal in the Americas, Portugal in Portugal, Portugal in Africa, Portugal in Asia. And in the room that was about Portugal in Portugal, I walked in, I saw this big painting, and I just stopped and stared at it. It's called O Chafariz do Rei, the King's Fountain. And it's from the 1500s, I think, done by a Dutch painter who I think his name is not known. And it was Portugal, it was Lisbon. It was the King's Fountain in Lisbon. And I thought, what are all these black folks doing in Portugal? In In the early 1500s, about 15% of Lisbon was African. And by the attitudes of the people in this painting, they were not all enslaved. Right in the foreground, there was an African descendant with a fancy hat on a horse. Now, if you were enslaved, you didn't get to be in downtown Lisbon on a horse. And he had on an outfit that suggested that he was part of some kind of Catholic brotherhood. There were people dancing. There were mixed couples dancing in this painting. It's a really interesting painting. And once I saw it, then I kept seeing it again. Chafariz del Rey is its name. Chafarizdel Rei or Y, I don't know. So, the let's see, I only know about Africans in Iberia and a little bit about Africans in the Vatican. There were two Christian kingdoms in Africa, Ethiopia, and I guess there were a couple of kingdoms within Ethiopia, and the Kingdom of Congo. And those kingdoms sent delegations to the Vatican. They were Catholic. They had to go see the Pope. There's a bust in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, in the Vatican area. The bust is of Manuel Nevunda, who was a delegate, a diplomat from the Congo Kingdom to the Vatican. So he had gone to see the Pope. Unfortunately, because of the weather, he died before he got to meet the Pope. But the Pope gave him his last rites. Plus, Congo had, they had diplomatic representations in Europe, and there are portraits of Congo diplomats. You can find them online if you look for Congo diplomats, particularly if you spell Congo with a K. You should see, I forget their names. But there are three major portraits by European portraitists of Congo diplomats. There were, spaces in the Vatican that represented people from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as well as from the Kingdom of Congo. In Seville in Spain, I went to a church that was, I don't remember its name, but it was Hijos del Congo or something like that. So it was a church that worshipped an African saint. Oceania, if you saw the full film, you'd see a little bit of New Caledonia and a little bit of Vanuatu, who are not, those populations are not as old as the Aborigines and the people in the interior of Papua New Guinea, who represent part of that early migration out of Africa about 80,000 years ago. So the Aboriginal population of Australia does not consider itself as being of African origin. Their attitude is, no, we're from here, we've always been here. And they've only been there about 80,000 years, but that's probably enough time to forget that you came from someplace else. So I need to know more about those populations. Plus, on all those multi-island nations like Indonesia, there are pockets of people referred to, Philippines, pockets of people referred to as negritos, little black people. Now, I'm sure they don't call themselves that. They have their own names. I think in the Philippines they're called Eta.
Ita and Igorot.
In the Philippines?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Do you know what islands they're on?
I would say there's still a good number of them in the main island, Luzon, and also in the southern portions of the Philippines, like in Mindanao and Visayas. I would say probably, from what I know from what my family has told me, like the Visayan region, so like mid to southern portions of the Philippines.
Thank you. So I need to go there, because it isn't legitimate for me to see, I call this an African diaspora. I'm not saying the yet, because I know I'm not yet exhaustive in knowing about this global diaspora. But I'm anxious to go to the Philippines and see those folks there, Vietnam, Malaysia. There are scattered populations in all those places, and they all have their own names, and I'm sure none of them calls themselves negritos. Yeah.
There was like a story recently about the Andaman Islands next to the Bay of Bengal, and it was like a story of this tourist who tried to swim over the sea and do something with them, and he got speared up and everything. But they were saying they don't have contact with like the rest of the world for like thousands of years and all that. Is there like a reason to it, like the diaspora, you say?
Well, I think the Andaman Islanders, are part of those populations generically referred to as Negritos. And they have been isolated. I think they like being isolated, and they're very hostile about being invaded. The Indian government prohibits people from going to their islands, and I think that guy, I forget his name, who went to Christianize them, well, they didn't want that, and so they were resistant. And I think that the Indian government makes it a crime for the boat people who took him there. I think they were punished for taking him there because they were supposed to leave those folks alone. There is, however, and I'm not sure if it's on Andaman or Nicobar, there's another island. Yeah, there's also tourism in which the indigenous people are kind of treated like they're animals in a zoo. And you can, on YouTube, there are some YouTubes about tourists going and looking at them and saying, you know, dance for us, stuff like that. So they've been pretty mistreated. And it seems reasonable for them to not want visitors. And the guy who went there knew that, but figured he would just, you know, Christianize them against their will.
Like, so were they just originated there, or did they flee like from Africa to there?
There were no people anyplace else in the world, so they had to have been of African origin. And the populations that are called Negritos are considered sort of vestigial populations that remained in small pockets in isolated places. And the people on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are part of those populations. Now, I'm not intending to visit them. That doesn't sound very safe. I want to go visit the folks in the Philippines and places where, you know, they're not going to spear you if you come to say hi.
No, I was thinking alone.
Steve.
I was wondering what you thought of the New York Times Magazine 1619 project, because I was thinking that what makes your project so much bigger than the New York Times project, because the New York Times project wants to think of America in terms of a starting point. You know, we think of starting points as like 1776, 1492 is Christopher Columbus. They wanted to say 1619 is the starting point because that's when Africans were brought to Jamestown. But that's so like narrow, it seems to me, to think of just in terms of the U.S., whereas your framework is so amazingly comparative and showing the links that we have between people in the U.S., people in Brazil, and people all over. I was wondering, like, that's my impression, that yours is so much larger and expansive and gets us to think about all the ways we're interconnected, whereas the 1619 project is just U.S. I don't know, but maybe my opinion is wrong, and I was just wondering what you were thinking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the 1619 project is really important because it involves rewriting the story of the United States. But I think that we need to look at the United States in the context of the rest of the Americas if we want to understand. When I talk about the 6.5 million people who came to the Americas, I'm talking about the Americas. I'm not just talking about the United States, since the United States was a really small portion of the whole story. And I mean, given that my experience was that I got to understand the United States by hanging out in other places, in Brazil, for example. The idea of finding my great-grandmother and finding her name as Congo, that came in Colombia. If you go to the Pacific coast of Colombia, to the town of Cali and around Cali and the north of the Cauca River Valley, you find all these people with African names. I mean, a whole bunch of African names. I have a listing of the African names from the 2006 phone book. Now, I guess there aren't any more phone books, so that's a real drag for people wanting to do this research. But there must be 30 or more names: Congo, Angola, Casamance, Mandinga, Dahomey, and Biafra. Lots of those, Benguela. And the people don't necessarily know that their names are African. And if they know they are, they may be ashamed, and they don't know why they would be African. And those are not African family names. Those are places of origin, ethnic names, like my great-grandmother, Amelia Congo, right? Nobody in Congo has Congo as a last name. But that means that her people would have come from the area of the Kingdom of Congo. So I do think 1619 is really important. I heard somebody talking about it and of how it also alludes to stuff we didn't know about Native Americans, like what? This woman was talking about names of military names, like names of planes and things. I don't remember most of them, but it was like Apache, Native American names, so that the whole military conquest of Native Americans still is used in the military to talk about weapons. So I thought, So we need a real redefinition of the United States, but I think we need the redefinition in the context of the larger picture. So absolutely, I mean, my area in the Americas is only from Chile to Canada, that's all. And when I went to the Americas Preparatory Conference for the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, on the same day, I went to this conference in Santiago, Chile, because I wanted to meet Afro-Chileans. I had to know if they existed. I had to know who they were, where they were, what they were doing. And the same day I met Afro-Chileans, the first organized group of Afro-Chileans, Oro Negro de Arica, in the north of Chile. And I met a man from Africville, Nova Scotia. So I could have gone home. That was why I went. And when I went to Africville, I had to go. I have to go to these places. I can't just go to the archives. It's a lot more convenient to go to the archives, but I have to go to the place. When I got to Africville, Nova Scotia, right, I guess it's in Halifax, when I saw the land, I thought, okay, I got it. Because you saw that it was a big park, beautiful park, sailboats going by. And it represents one of those places from which African descendants were expelled in the name of things like urban renewal. Where I live in Washington, I live in Southwest Washington. Southwest was the first urban renewal project in the United States. What that means is all those poor folks who lived by the port were expelled, and they were told, oh, we'll build you new houses and you can come back. Well, that's never true. Happened in Uruguay. There are 3 areas where Afro-Uruguayans used to live in tenements. But they're right by that nice big river in an area that was ripe for gentrification. And so they were expelled during one of the military dictatorships. The communities were broken up. So people who had created cultural forms were spread out. The cultural forms were essentially killed off, homogenized, minimized. One of the, and so when I saw Africville, I thought, oh, okay, I get it, I understand. Just seeing the land. Where I live in Southwest DC, now it was gentrified in the 60s, now it's being re-gentrified. So, for an example of the kind of cultural murder that happened in Uruguay was when these folks were dispersed. Initially, the tenement clusters each one had its own musical styles. And the musical styles fascinated me, made Uruguay fascinate me. I had known nothing about Uruguay before. But in the 1900s, they had what were called las llamadas, the calls, las llamadas, in the Uruguayan Spanish dialect. And what it was that Africans from different ethnic groups were allowed to come out on Sundays and dance in the market square. Same thing happened in Congo Square in Louisiana, perhaps also in Congo Square in Philadelphia, right by Independence Square. And each ethnic group somebody from each ethnic group would come out playing their own rhythms, so their own calls, their own llamadas. And so if I were an Igbo and I heard my Igbo drums and I go follow those drums, the Congos would follow their drums. And so there was a whole panoply of African musics and dances going on in this market square. Those were continued in the various tenement clusters, conventillos in Montevideo and Ecuador. When those communities were broken up, those musical styles were broken up too. And now, they have this llamada festival, the festival of the calls, but they seem to have like one rhythm that's become homogenized and boring, whereas they used to have distinguishably different African rhythms until gentrification happened.
Yeah. I've been sitting on this question, but now I feel encouraged by you mentioning Biafra and Igbo. Last weekend, I met literally a minion of Igbo males who came to our synagogue and claimed to be Jewish. I said, wow, that's fantastic seeing you all sitting here with your talit. And one of the elders told me later on that they were really Biafran and that the British invented this country called Nigeria, and they're not Nigerian. Can you please educate me more on Igbo? Thank you.
Yeah, the countries that you may know as African countries now were created in 1885 in Berlin. It's called the Treaty of Berlin. And so in 1885, the European powers, Portugal, France, Spain, England, Germany, United States was there too, but didn't, well, it had its own little piece, Liberia. But so that was when Africa was carved up. There's a British historian, Basil Davidson, who talks about the carving up of the cake. So Africa is a cake that was carved up. And so the Europeans determined, okay, well, I'll take from this river to this river, and up to those mountains up there. So they defined the boundaries of what became the current African nations. And so the current African nations don't make any sense. I call them the European nations of Africa, right? Because no African was in Berlin. So people who didn't like each other necessarily, but who had their own space, their own governments, and just had to interact as neighbors. Well, now they're part of one country, and they're all, say, supposed to be Nigerian. So the Hausa, the Igbo, the Yoruba, they're all supposed to be Nigerian together. Well, but they're separate people. They have different languages, different customs. They've coexisted as neighbors for a long time, but now they're supposed to become the same thing, a Nigerian. They're still as culturally different as they were before. So they have this icing on the cake, in a sense. It says, well, we're all Nigerians. But it's totally artificial. So people were put together and people were separated. The Somali people they were broken up into 5 parts. And they're very homogeneous. They look similar to each other. They're all Muslims. They all speak the same language, Somali. They all have the same lifestyle. But they were broken into British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, the Ogaden district of Ethiopia, and another one that I'm forgetting.
The northern part of Kenya.
Huh?
The northern part of Kenya.
Oh, yeah, the Northern Frontier District.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's his people. They should have one country. They had the dream of greater Somaliland, bringing them all together. Except Kenya's not about to give up the Northern Frontier District. They're willing to give up the Somalis, but they want to keep the land. There was Somalia attacked Ethiopia because in the Ogaden district of Ethiopia, the people are Somali. And Somalia attacked Ethiopia, Somalia lost, but they got refugees, but they didn't get the land. So the problem was that Europe divided Africa into places that were not meant to work as African spaces. They were okay as colonies when the colonizers were enforcing their togetherness. But now that they're on their own, we were like, well, we really didn't want this. Hence, Biafra wanted to secede. They knew that they were the source of a lot of the cash flow for the country, and they felt that they were supporting other people who were not their friends. So they didn't want to be part of it.
All right, so we'll make that our last question. Can everybody please give Dr. Walker